If you've played a video game in the last couple of years, you've probably played or at least heard of Breath of the Wild, the latest and biggest Zelda game to date. In the lead up to Breath of the Wild 2's launch, we're here to talk about the top 6 things we'd like to see in Nintendo's follow-up. Announced at E3 2019, Breath of the Wild 2 lit the gaming world ablaze. Listening to developers talk about the original Breath of the Wild's production reveals how much work was done and redone on the game to ready it for release. With Breath of the Wild 2, Nintendo has announced the world and core gameplay loop of Breath of the Wild will return, with much more time being spent on adding content to an existing world rather than designing one from the ground up. Considering all of this, we've got the definitive Breath of the Wild 2 wishlist. Weapon durability. It wouldn't be a Breath of the Wild 2 wishlist without putting fixing weapon durability at the tippity top. Much has been said about weapons in Breath of the Wild, and little of it has been positive. After a few whacks, chances are whatever weapon you've got won't be around much longer. And for the vast majority of interesting weapons, there isn't an easy way to replace them, nor is there a good way to repair damaged weapons. This is much, much worse if you played Breath of the Wild on Master Mode, where it's a common occurrence for a fully undamaged weapon to break over the course of a fight with a single enemy. Ultimately, combat becomes a cost-benefit analysis. Are the rewards for fighting a certain enemy worth what it'll cost in weapon durability? The unfortunate answer to this question a lot of the time is no. Once you move past the Great Plateau and get into the open world, the longer you play, the less reason there is to fight anybody, especially common mobs if you're using a fragile, rare weapon. This is not to say that weapon durability should be axed, though. If weapons never broke, there would be less incentive to explore the game world. Accordingly, we would like to see weapon durability increased across the board, as well as either certain weapons that won't break or can be repaired. Perhaps powerful special weapons could have incredibly low durability but could be repaired, while common weapons won't break. Or common weapons could break easily, as they might in real life, while special weapons stick around for a while. Either way, weapons were way too flimsy in Breath of the Wild, and we think Breath of the Wild 2 needs to address this first and foremost. Dungeons. There are tons and tons of shrines in Breath of the Wild, 120 in fact, and many of them can be quite clever. But those complex, dense dungeons of Zelda yore didn't quite make the cut. According to the developers, this wasn't because dungeons didn't work or Zelda had evolved beyond them. It was instead to keep the game on schedule and on budget. The fact of the matter was that, as a whole, while numerous, shrines in Breath of the Wild can largely be breezed through fairly quickly and easily, if you know what you're doing. In Breath of the Wild 2, we would like to see shrines make a return, but we'd like a healthy number of bigger, more traditional dungeons as well. Considering how development time and resources would have to be then split between creating dungeons and shrines, we'd like to see fewer shrines overall. But fewer shrines means the shrines that do make the cut should be a little more elaborate. To help differentiate shrines and dungeons gating powerful weapons or equipment or story progress behind these rare special dungeons would be a good fit, and it would help the game maintain a healthy sense of variety in its puzzles. Changes to weapon durability would dovetail nicely with dungeons. Maybe each dungeon holds a unique legendary weapon that cannot break or at least could be repaired, and once you've traveled to and completed all the dungeons, you'll be kitted out with high-level gear to enter the late game. As a hallmark of the Zelda franchise, though, whatever form dungeons take is sure to be a win. More story. Since we're talking about video games, we're contractually obligated to mention Dark Souls. The Legend of Zelda series has always existed on the opposite side of the RPG spectrum as compared to Dark Souls. Dark Souls is, well, it's dark and mysterious. Its world is well suited to ambiguous lore, not some sort of hackneyed hero's journey adventure. Zelda, on the other hand, is all about a sense of adventure, starring familiar, likable characters and pulling from a set of appropriately bad baddies. With that essential journey in Breath of the Wild beyond the trite, "Go kill Ganon," much of the charm of the world of Zelda can be lost, as there's less traditional Zelda. And this isn't because Zelda games are necessarily known for their spectacularly complex plots and sensationally witty dialogue. No, it's because Zelda and Link are beloved, timeless characters meant to go on adventures. The draw of Breath of the Wild isn't the sprawling plains of Hyrule Field or the "see those mountains, you can climb those" gimmick. Just like every other Zelda game, the appeal is the sense of adventure. In Breath of the Wild, this is done by way of exploration and organic discovery, but historically, Zelda games have had much more robust plots. With Breath of the Wild 2, we would like to see more of an emphasis on narrative, in addition to exploration and discovery. The story doesn't need to overexert itself and try to one-up other open-world RPG greats like The Witcher 3 or Horizon Zero Dawn. It just needs to involve a familiar cast of Zelda characters and put them on an adventure. Give gamers some motivation beyond exploration and discovery to travel off to distant, dangerous places. Enemy spawns. In Breath of the Wild, defeated enemies come back to life during the Blood Moon. Blood moons, frustratingly, occur somewhat randomly, but you'll never go too long without experiencing one, as this mechanic also respawns weapons and ingredients. The Blood Moon, considering Breath of the Wild's weapon durability system, is how the game stays filled with stuff to collect. Unfortunately, with how fragile weapons are and how farming most enemies for resources is not worth it, there's not all that much incentive to defeat enemies you've defeated before, and even less so to go out of your way to fight new instances of enemies you've seen many times before. This problem is way more pronounced on Master Mode, where taking down most enemies simply is not worth it. What this means is that after you've discovered a place or explored an area, it makes a lot more sense to run through the location as opposed to continually fighting the same enemies. The more time you put into a game, the less valuable the drops from any given enemy will be, because as your stores continue to grow, you won't need that much. Changes to the weapon durability system as well as dungeons hiding powerful unbreakable equipment will go a long way towards making combat more worthwhile. But in Breath of the Wild 2, we'd like to see the Blood Moon only respawn certain enemies, like common mobs that populate the world, and continually upgrade the power and loot of regularly dispatched enemies in major ways. Coupled with our previous suggestions, combat would be much more engaging in Breath of the Wild 2 without changing the core gameplay loop. XP and a skill tree. Problems with gear and combat, as well as the frustrating nature of the Blood Moon, could all be swiftly dealt with if we could level up Link and unlock new abilities and improvements for him. Many opportunities for fighting make sense if you're continuously unlocking things to experiment with. Weapons constantly breaking could be alleviated by a perk that allows for repair or for weapons to simply become more durable. Even something more roundabout like ways to buff weapons or otherwise damage enemies would make how fragile weapons are sting a little less. There are many ways Breath of the Wild 2 could level Link up, the simplest of which being a basic XP system and a skill tree. Give players experience for defeating monsters and let us spend that experience on interesting new abilities. These don't have to be awe-inspiringly powerful. Even ways to run faster, acquire more items, or make cooking easier would be worthwhile enough to spend some experience you gained from killing monsters on. With a more developed story and an XP system, Breath of the Wild 2 would have tons of progression to keep even long playthroughs feeling fresh, while still keeping the heart of Breath of the Wild, the exploration and discovery, totally intact. These systems may not sound or be all that innovative, but they're RPG mainstays for a good reason. With a large open world to explore and little direction given to the player, a sense of progression can be hard to come by. Systems like these could better leverage Breath of the Wild's awesome world, further encouraging players to explore. And most importantly, XP wouldn't undercut the core gameplay loop as it exists. Instead, simply supplementing it, giving players access to a wider range of tools to further encourage creative problem solving. People and quests. Breath of the Wild is a massive game, and there's an enormous variety of locations to explore. However, most of the world doesn't have all that many people, and even monsters aren't grouped that densely. Exploration and discovery are admittedly awesome, but they can also be lonely. We'd like to see Breath of the Wild 2 massively up the NPC count. Give us more towns and villages, yes, but give us small settlements and roaming caravans. Put people out adventuring and make battles take place. We don't just want NPCs who could spit out some sound or phrases when the player walks by. We want characters, people that we can get quests from. Breath of the Wild 2 doesn't need to try and compete with the likes of The Witcher 3 in terms of side quest depth or number, but populating the world with interesting characters that we can interact with and grab quests from goes a really long way towards building a world that feels alive. On top of all of that, more people and quests would dovetail nicely with an XP system, rewarding players with experience rather than weapons, resources, or health, which already have their own systems in-game that players can use to customize Link. Quests that involve combat would also go a long way towards justifying an aggressive respawn system, as there will need to be certain enemies for certain quests. In the end, questing is an essential part of the RPG experience. And since Zelda has become a much more modern, open-world, 3D third-person action RPG, quests would feel right at home in Breath of the Wild 2. So, what would you most like to see in Breath of the Wild 2? Are you happy Nintendo's making a sequel, or would you rather an all-new Zelda experience? Make sure to let us know in the comments down below, and for videos just like this one, why don't you go ahead and subscribe to us here at TheGamer and ring that little notification bell to stay up to date. As always, thanks a lot for watching.